It's often said that necessity is the mother of invention. When problems arise, the most successful people adapt their approach and overcome every obstacle in their path. This skill applies to almost any domain. We see it in business all the time. Visionaries like Steve Jobs, who pivoted their strategies to meet challenging consumer needs, or Richard Branson, who started out with a record label and then branched out into airlines, cell phones, hotels, and dozens of other ventures. We see it in pop stars like Madonna, David Bowie, and Miley Cyrus, artists who perpetually stay ahead of the curve by reinventing their image, sound, and persona to stay relevant and influential. And of course, we see it in politicians who are against something one year and for it the next. Is it really a change of heart, or is it just chasing votes to win elections? The concept of reinvention itself, however, carries with it a number of risks. There's always a sense of uncertainty and potential for unseen dangers. Well, that was the case in 2019 for former Arkansas State Senator Linda Collins Smith, who was trying to reinvent herself after losing her most recent election. She'd already switched political parties and now had her eyes set on Washington, D.C. Linda was also coming out of a particularly nasty divorce and started dating again. Even the inside of her modest house was being completely gutted and remodeled. Linda was looking for a fresh start. But when she went mysteriously missing after a trip to D.C., her friends and family began to worry. Had she stumbled into danger exploring one of her new pursuits? Or had something from her past come back to haunt her? Join me now as we examine the strange case of Linda Collins Smith. You'll hear how the murder of a high-profile politician sparked an online firestorm of wild conspiracy theories, pointing fingers in all directions, and how investigators ultimately uncovered the shocking truth. This was no conspiracy. This was betrayal. With an economy based primarily on manufacturing, construction, and agriculture, the term salt of the earth comes to mind when describing the hardworking residents of Pocahontas, an extremely tight-knit rural community nestled in the picturesque Ozark Mountain region. The beautiful landscape surrounding Pocahontas is defined by rolling hills, lush forests, and winding rivers. It's the kind of place where it's easy to lose cell phone service just by driving a few short miles out of town. But with a population of just 7,000, it's probably not the kind of place most people think of when they imagine the home of a powerful state-level politician, especially one who grew up in a shack without running water. But Linda Collins, whose childhood has been described as dirt poor, would credit her hardscrabble upbringing by modeling her into the person she became. And although her hardworking parents would eventually be able to get running water into their home when Linda was in her teens, she claimed that all those years of cutting firewood and hauling buckets of water from a nearby stream taught her the value of hard work. It also taught her to appreciate the true meaning of opportunity and determination. After graduating, Linda went on to marry her high school sweetheart, and together they had 2 children, their son Butch and daughter Tate. But eventually, the couple separated, and Linda needed to find work that could support her raising 2 children on her own. Without a college degree, Linda gravitated towards sales and soon discovered she had a natural talent for it. She started out selling Tupperware and eventually made the climb into real estate. Then, in 1995, when her children were still in grade school and Linda was 33, she found love again when she married a local municipal court judge named Phil Smith. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, becoming very successful in business, buying 2 hotels and capitalizing on the area's growing tourism industry. And that success only grew when Phil was appointed by the governor to sit on the Arkansas Third Circuit Court in 2001, a position he'd held for the next 16 years. Throughout her life, Linda had always been interested in local politics and established herself as a well-known community leader. As a member of numerous committees, councils, and associations, Linda was once chosen as her county's Woman of the Year, so it really was no surprise when she announced her candidacy for Arkansas State Representative in 2010. Linda, who'd been raised her whole life as a Southern Democrat, won her election running on the Democratic ticket. But just 8 months into her first term, she shocked the political world by officially switching parties while in office.
I'm here today to announce that I have joined the Republican Party of Arkansas. My decision was made after much thought, prayer, and discussion with my family. I came to Little Rock this past January to carry out a solemn pledge I made to my friends back home. A pledge to be a different kind of legislator. I ran as a Democrat because I was raised a Democrat. My father and my grandfather before him were Democrats. I know that most Democratic voters in my home counties are informed citizens who understand these issues. They are people who believe in the solid conservative principles of limited government, financial responsibility, and the creation of jobs for hardworking people.
Needless to say, Linda was seen by many Democrats as a traitor to her own party. But according to Linda, she believed it was the party that betrayed her.
If you remember one thing today, I hope it's this. I have not changed. I am the same today as I was when the people of Randolph and Sharp counties elected me. I have not left the Democratic Party, but the party left me. And I believe it has left the majority of good, decent, freedom-loving people of Arkansas behind.
Throughout her first term in office, Linda's star continued to rise, and in 2014, she was elected to serve in the Arkansas State Senate. Even though she stood a mere 5 feet tall, Linda became known as a political pit bull and wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers along the way. Never shying away from tackling some of the most controversial political issues, Linda earned the nickname the linebacker from her fellow senators. By the end of 2017, Linda was a popular yet polarizing political figure, with her stance on several key issues putting her squarely at odds with Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson. So when it came time for her re-election in 2018, the governor officially endorsed her challenger in the Republican primary. In a stunning defeat, Linda lost the election by just 573 votes. Her career as a senator was over. But this was far from the only major shakeup in Linda's life. After 20 years of marriage to Phil Smith, the couple decided to call it quits just before Linda's re-election bid, and it's believed by many that her divorce became a major personal distraction during her campaign. Because Linda and Phil owned several businesses together, an ensuing battle over finances caused the divorce settlement to drag on for years. According to friends and family, the divorce became extremely acrimonious, with the couple fighting over every single thing. In the end, Phil was awarded the lion's share of their mutual assets. But Linda immediately filed an appeal, which would prolong the case for another year and a half. At 57, Linda found herself completely unmoored from the life she'd known for the past 25 years. Her career in the Arkansas General Assembly was over, her marriage had fallen to pieces, and the divorce was threatening her financial stability. Linda coped by spending extra time with her 3 young grandchildren and trying to move on. But still, Linda believed she had more to accomplish in the realm of politics and set her sights on Washington, D.C. She began exploring the possibility of becoming a special interest lobbyist in the nation's capital, a position that would allow her to continue affecting policy while also giving her a much larger paycheck than she'd been making as a public servant. She'd changed her stripes before. She was confident she could do it again. Linda also began moving on in her personal life as well. In the spring of 2019, she started dating a man named Rendell Wallace, who she'd actually dated many years before. In fact, there was a period in time when Linda had been dating both Rendell and Phil Smith before her marriage. Back then, Linda had chosen Phil over Rendell, but now she told Rendell she'd chosen the wrong man. Even after all these years, Rendell was only too pleased by her sudden change of heart. And soon they began spending lots of time together, going out dancing and spending the night together several times.
It just picked up and we was just happy to be with one another, you know. We went down to the Eagles and had a few drinks and danced because we loved to dance, me and her both. So we hooked up and we went down there and danced and wound up spending the night in Jonesboro at a motel.
Rendell and Linda had only been dating for a couple of weeks when Linda scheduled an important business trip towards the end of May. She was flying to Washington, D.C. to interview for a potential lobbying job. Linda's children, Butch and Tate, encouraged her in her new adventure and thought Washington, D.C. would be an exciting place for their mother to pursue her passions and interests. On Memorial Day, May 27th, Linda returned to Pocahontas after her interview. Through text messages with her children, she let them know she'd made it home safe and that things were looking very promising in Washington. But that would be the last message they'd ever receive from her. Over the next week, her daughter Tate made multiple attempts to message her mother. Although everyone knew Linda was an extremely busy woman and didn't always respond right away, still, after several days, Tate became extremely worried. Because Tate lived approximately 2.5 hours away from her mother, she asked her brother Butch, who still lived in the area, to go check on her. On June 3rd, when Butch arrived at his mother's house, just outside of Pocahontas, he noticed her red pickup truck parked in the driveway. However, when he knocked on the door, there was no answer, and the door was locked. Peering through the windows, he didn't notice anything alarming, so he left. The following day, June 4th, with still no word from Linda, Butch and Tate asked their grandfather Benny, who had a key to her place, if he could go check on her. When Benny arrived at his daughter's house, he discovered her back door was surprisingly unlocked. But after going inside and checking all the rooms, he didn't find any sign of his daughter. Looking around the house, it was difficult to tell whether or not anything seemed out of place. The entire house was being gutted for a complete remodel. Cabinets, flooring, and even some walls had been torn out. Bits and bobs of construction equipment were scattered all about. But there was something disturbing that caught Benny's eye. The flooring in Linda's kitchen had been recently taken up, exposing the plywood subfloor beneath. And right in the very middle of the floor was a very large dark stain, as if some dark liquid had been spilled and soaked into the wood. Concerned by what he saw, Benny called Butch and asked him to come take a look as well. When Butch arrived, he took a video of the odd stain and sent it to his sister Tate. They hypothesized that their mother may have dropped a pot of coffee on the floor. But even if it was coffee, it didn't make any sense that their mother had just left it all over the floor. Something was clearly wrong. When Butch and Benny walked back outside through the front door, they noticed a foul smell, like a dead animal. The smell seemed to be coming from a large pile of building materials covered by a large tarp in front of Linda's garage. Walking over to investigate, Butch lifted up the tarp to take a look, and what was underneath was a horrific image that continues to haunt him to this day.
She was lying face down, wrapped in one of my old comforters, and shoved underneath the tarp in her driveway. I will never not be able to see that picture burned in my brain. The smell of a dead body laying outside wrapped up in that tarp for approximately a week in the Arkansas summer. The swarm of flies that flew out and surrounded me. The sight of her white blonde hair moving because the number of maggots crawling on her scalp. The last memory of her that I have was of me making a 911 call and trying not to vomit at the sight and smell of my mother's body.
Reeling from shock, Butch had to physically restrain his grandfather from coming any closer. He knew he'd never be able to forget what he'd just seen, and couldn't bear the thought of it being the last image Benny would have of his daughter.
We've been trying to find her for the last few days, almost a week, and we've not heard from her.
What is your name, honey?
Butch Smith, I'm her son, and we came to do a wellness check at her house. I think I found a body.
Okay, honey, we'll get an ambulance out of that way, okay?
From the moment Randolph County Sheriff's deputies arrived at Linda's house, there was no question they were dealing with a homicide. After the scene was cordoned off, investigators set to work collecting potential evidence. An autopsy would determine Linda had been stabbed multiple times with what appeared to be a large knife, and based on her state of decomposition, estimated she'd been dead for at least several days, possibly even a week or more. Inside Linda's kitchen, police recognized immediately that the large stain on the floor had come from blood, not coffee. They also found a spray bottle of bleach nearby with a blood stain on the nozzle. Clearly, someone had attempted to clean up the scene. Outside, more evidence of the crime scene cover-up was also discovered. On every corner of Linda's house, police noticed mounting brackets for security cameras, at least 9 of them. But despite seeing the brackets, the cameras themselves were all conspicuously missing. Someone was trying to cover their tracks. Police knew full well that the murder of a well-known politician would lead to an absolute media frenzy, so a gag order was placed over the entire investigation, preventing police from sharing any information with reporters. The last thing detectives or prosecutors wanted was for their future jury pool to be tainted by bad information. Detectives started their investigation by interviewing people closest to Linda. First her family, Benny, Butch, and Tate, and then 2 of Linda's closest friends. Not only did they want to get a closer understanding of who Linda was, they also needed to establish a timeline between Memorial Day, when Linda returned from D.C., and the time of her murder, which had still not been established by that point. Tim Loggins and Becky O'Donnell had been 2 of Linda's closest friends for several years, hitting things off over politics. But it was during Linda's messy divorce that her friendship with Becky and Tim deepened, and they became her go-to confidants. Which is when Linda began sharing troubling details about her ex, Phil, raising concerns for her safety. Concerned for their friend, Tim and Becky installed security cameras around Linda's house as a precautionary measure. Becky even became Linda's personal assistant and chauffeur, helping Linda run her Senate campaign and managing all her business affairs. Pretty much everyone knew that if you wanted to find out what Linda was up to, you just had to ask Becky. That's why investigators hoped that when they interviewed Becky, she'd be able to give them an idea of her friend's whereabouts after she returned to Arkansas from D.C. According to Becky, she picked up Linda from the airport on May 27th, and on the drive home they called Tim so Linda could chat about her trip to Washington. The next morning, on May 28th, Becky claimed Linda had called her and asked her to pick up some lunch and bring it over to her house. When Becky arrived, she said Linda had some exciting news to share with her, but it wasn't about politics. Instead, Linda revealed that her new boyfriend, Rendell Wallace, had spent the night. And although she was clearly excited about how their relationship was progressing, there was one thing she mentioned to Becky that was bothering her.
I went out there and she told me all about the night before because the man out there, Rendell, spent the night with her. She was talking about how the night before it had taken Rendell like 4 hours to respond to her text and calls. And she was kind of upset about it. You know, she was wondering if he had been with somebody else and that's why he wasn't responding.
Becky felt that Linda's concern was probably misplaced. She knew Rendell lived outside of town in an area with extremely spotty cell service and told Linda she was probably just overanalyzing the situation. But it was a comment that led to a small tiff between the best friends.
She was kind of upset about it, and I told her she had no right to be upset. I told her she needed to slow down and take it easy and get to know me.
When they went their separate ways, their disagreement had left a bit of tension between them. And when Becky called Linda later that day, hoping to smooth things over, it seemed Linda was still holding on to the grudge. That's why it was surprising when Linda mentioned she was considering spending the next few nights at Rendell's place.
I said, I thought you didn't want me in your personal stuff. Don't tell me. And she hung up on me.
Meanwhile, at the same time Becky was being interviewed, Tim was being questioned in a separate room, telling them basically the same story as Becky. According to Tim, he believed that Rendell was most likely the last person to see Linda alive. Detectives knew they needed to look into Rendell Wallace. After all, it was a bit suspicious that several days after bringing a new man into her life, Linda turned up murdered. But when questioned, Rendell corroborated much of Becky's story and told police how he'd spent the evening with Linda on the night she'd returned from her trip to D.C.
She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Nothing. I'm laying here on the couch watching TV." And she said, "Why don't you come over?" I said, "I'd love to."
After spending the night at Linda's, Rendell said he left the next morning.
And we hugged and kissed, and she let me out the door and locked the door behind me. I never heard anything from her since. But I thought, well, she's just in meetings, down in Little Rock. She'll get back to me later on.
According to Rendell, the last time he'd seen or heard from Linda was when he kissed her goodbye. If she had been planning spending several nights at his place, like Becky claimed, she'd never mention it to him. But despite being the last person to have seen Linda alive, Rendell was cleared as a suspect for reasons that have never been released. Detectives did, however, have another suspect on their list. Because Pocahontas was such a small town, and Linda such a prominent figure within it, everybody, including the sheriff, knew about Linda's nasty divorce with her ex-husband, Phil. So when it came for a possible motive for murder, it was no surprise to when Phil immediately became the primary suspect. In Phil's view, Linda had completely ruined his career and had made the last several years of his life a living hell. During their bitter divorce, Linda accused Phil of watching pornography on his work computer. That is, the computer inside the judge's chamber at the courthouse. Obviously, this is a major no-no, and when Phil was placed under oath during a deposition, he was forced to admit the accusation was true. The result was a lifetime ban from ever serving as a judge in the state of Arkansas, a terrible black eye forever staining his reputation after more than 20 years of service. It was no secret among Linda's friends and family that she'd become terrified of Phil during this period. She even told her friends the classic line, "If I wind up dead, it was Phil who murdered me." During both Butch and Tate's police interviews, they didn't shy away from telling police just how scared Linda had become of her ex-husband. According to Butch, Linda believed that Phil had already tried to kill her once before.
I fully believe, firmly, with everything, believe that she was afraid of him. Let me tell you a story. My mom was sick for several years, and it was kind of, everybody knew that she was sick, and then nobody could figure out what in the world was wrong with her.
About 15 years earlier, Linda fell ill from a mysterious affliction. She'd lost all her energy and could barely get out of bed some days. Eventually, doctors discovered high levels of mercury in her blood. One doctor told her it looked like she'd drunk an entire thermometer. Eventually, Linda recovered and regained her strength and energy. But years later, during her divorce, she became convinced that Phil had deliberately poisoned her with mercury. Detectives knew there was no way they could prove those accusations now. But there was no question that at the time of her murder, Linda was extremely fearful of Phil. However, despite their deep suspicions, detectives couldn't find any evidence linking Phil to Linda's murder. In fact, during the investigation, Phil offered his full cooperation with police and denied that Linda had any reasons whatsoever to be frightened of him. As the investigation continued, Linda's daughter Tate decided to try logging into her mother's email account, which is when she stumbled upon a major potential clue. A number of automatic notifications from Linda's security cameras that had come through on May 28th. Linda's security cameras, the ones that were now strangely missing, were battery-powered and connected to the cloud through Wi-Fi. The system not only allowed Linda to view the camera feeds from her cell phone, but it also sent motion-activated alerts to her email whenever the camera detected movement. Although the footage from these cameras wasn't stored anywhere physically, police wondered if the past surveillance footage might exist on the security company's servers. So detectives issued a subpoena to the security company so they could get those files. Although news of Linda's murder became a hot-button national news story because of the gag order instituted immediately after her murder, the media had little official information to work with. They even falsely reported that Linda had been shot to death, not stabbed. There were also some seriously wild claims. Bogus rumors spreading like wildfire on a number of forums and blogs, claiming Linda's murder was linked to a hodgepodge of various conspiracy theories. To make matters even worse, another former politician named Jonathan Nichols from neighboring Oklahoma was discovered dead the day after Linda. Although his death was conclusively ruled a suicide, for conspiracy theorists online, this development was like pouring gasoline on an open fire. Soon, a growing number of people began to believe the police were engaging in a massive cover-up of the truth, and police in Randolph County knew they needed to make a major break in the case before the gossip got completely out of hand. A few days after filing their subpoena, police received Linda's entire catalog of security surveillance footage. Although there were hundreds of hours to pour through, investigators had a pretty good idea of the time frame they needed to focus on. Because of the email notifications Tate had discovered, investigators focused their efforts on the footage from May 28th, the day investigators now believed Linda was murdered. Initially, when investigators started watching footage from that day, they were disappointed. It appeared the camera's motion sensors had simply been activated by the tarp outside Linda's garage blowing in the wind. And just as they were beginning to wonder if the footage would provide any clues, they heard a blood-curdling scream from inside the house. And there was no doubt what they were listening to: Linda's murder. When ABC's 2020 aired some of the surveillance from the case, they decided not to include the screams from the murder itself. They described the recording as so graphic and so disturbing that it wasn't appropriate for broadcast. Even though detectives could hear the murder, they still didn't have any clue who the perpetrator could be. However, one thing was clear. Whoever it was had been extremely careful to avoid being captured on the cameras, as none of the footage showed the perpetrator exiting the house. The next image captured by the cameras was taken at night, and it showed a truly chilling scene. A person deliberately concealing themselves beneath a white bedsheet, entering Linda's house through her unlocked back door. All the footage after this appears to have come from the inside of a bag. Clearly, this is when the perpetrators set about removing the cameras from their mounts. But because they were battery-powered and motion-activated, they were still able to upload to the cloud even after being taken down. And this is when detectives found their smoking gun. One of the cameras was activated from inside what appeared to be a red purse, its straps and magnetic snap clearly visible. Facing directly upward, the camera revealed the ceiling of Linda's kitchen. A renovation hole in the ceiling's drywall left zero doubt about the location. Then, the figure of a woman could be seen placing a large kitchen knife into the bag. Blood covered her hands. And when her face came into view, there was no mistaking the killer's identity. It was the woman who claimed to be Linda's best friend, her personal assistant, Becky O'Donnell. On June 15th, 2019, a public memorial for Linda Collins was held at her local Baptist church in Pocahontas. As friends and family made their way to the church, investigators scrambled to secure an immediate warrant for Becky's arrest. When the warrant came through, police arrested Becky as she and Tim were pulling into the memorial service. When they got Becky down to the station, detectives wasted no time confronting her with the evidence they discovered.
I bet he said right here, I'm gonna lay it all out there for you, okay? You're under the rest of the murder, Linda. You understand me?
We got you.
We got you.
We got video of you.
You didn't erase them all.
We got you.
Becky's body language during this brief encounter was incredible to watch. When she's informed they're charging her with murder, she reacts with a look of shock and disbelief, as if it's the craziest thing she'd ever heard. Immediately, the detective holds up a photo that shows Becky holding the knife that killed Linda and says, "We got ya." In an instant, Becky's face changes from the look of pretend shock to one of actual shock as she realizes the rest of her life is now over. That's when Becky immediately demands a lawyer.
You're about to hear the fiance right now unequivocally stand by his woman, who this morning still sits in jail, and she is accused of being a killer. But the fiance is accusing police of having blinders on.
She is sad that this is hurting her family, but she's angry and she's strong.
Who's she mad at?
Whoever arrested her and why.
O'Donnell is spending a second week in jail, and her fiancé, Tim Loggins, claims police have made a huge and inexplicable error.
She has been arrested now for capital murder, and you and Becky don't have any idea why?
None whatsoever. They were very close. You don't understand, Becky worked for Linda, but Linda was a family friend. It was like Becky's sister, Linda was like my sister.
You would classify them as best friends?
Yes.
Are you 100% certain that your fiancée, Becky, had nothing to do with the murder of Linda Collins?
Yes, I am.
You had nothing to do with the murder of Linda Collins?
I did not.
Has it crossed your mind for a moment where you question, well, maybe Becky is capable of this?
Becky's not capable of this.
You haven't had that
I haven't
moment
questioned that.
at all?
No. I mean, either she is a best actress in the world and a sociopath and completely fooled me, or there's not a chance she did this.
Even after Becky's arrest, police were still under the gag order regarding the case. Nobody knew at that point that prosecutors literally had the killer on camera holding the murder weapon. During phone calls between Tim and Becky in jail, she continued proclaiming her innocence by leaning into the online rumors of conspiracy and cover-up.
I love you.
I love you. I believe in you. You got a lot of people.
I know that, honey. Baby, they're that good. They're that powerful. The stuff they have made up on me right now. If I was on the outside looking in, I would say, oh, wow.
During this time, Tim kept telling anyone who'd listen that he believed Becky was innocent. But there were a lot of things about his fiancée that Tim didn't know. Things police were now just uncovering. It turned out that 10 years earlier, Becky was at the center of a murder-for-hire investigation. Her previous husband, Jeffrey O'Donnell, contacted police when he discovered Becky had been asking her friends to kill him for her, offering $50,000 to get the job done. But Becky escaped being charged after claiming it was just something she joked about when she was drunk one night. Although she was let off scot-free, it was the end of her marriage. Then in 2014, Becky was caught stealing merchandise from a local consignment store where she worked as a cashier. The owner was a close friend of Becky's sister and decided to fire her instead of filing charges. But when Becky's sister heard about the attempted theft, she sent the owner a blistering message in response. It read, "I wish you would have pressed charges against my sister. In the last 6 months, I have found out that she has stolen from so many people, and only one person went after her. She stole all my mom's retirement money, about $160K. She has stolen from my ex-boyfriends, and she has also opened up credit cards in her kids' names and maxed them out and never paid the bills, ruining their credit. She's a piece of shit, and I haven't spoken to her for over a year." Becky's criminal record also contained one conviction for theft, which resulted in probation for a period of 3 years. During their investigation, detectives discovered that Becky had been regularly stealing money from Linda, as much as $50K, by forging her signature on checks. Investigators believe that Linda was tipped off about the missing money by her daughter Tate, who'd noticed money had mysteriously gone missing from some of her mother's accounts. Police theorized that when Linda learned Becky was stealing from her, she confronted her on May 28th inside her home, which is when Becky grabbed a kitchen knife and attacked Linda. In a bizarre twist to the case, additional charges against Becky were announced in January 2020. This time, she was accused of plotting the murder of Linda's ex-husband, Phil Smith, from behind bars. 2 separate jailhouse inmates came forward to authorities, claiming Becky had offered them large sums of money to murder Phil and make it look like a suicide. She believed this would lend credence to her claims of innocence. At first, police were reluctant to believe the jailhouse snitch's claims, but they handed over a fake suicide note that Becky had given to them to leave behind after murdering Phil. A note written in Becky's own handwriting suggesting that Phil was the one who'd murdered Linda. It was the final desperate ploy of a woman who knew she'd never get out of prison. For over a year, Becky continued maintaining her claims of innocence from behind bars. But in August 2020, she surprised prosecutors by accepting a plea deal.
An Arkansas woman pleads guilty to murdering a former state senator. Rebecca O'Donnell admitted to the killing of Linda Collins Smith today in court and was sentenced to 57 years in prison for the crime. Had she not accepted a plea deal, she faced a potential death sentence. O'Donnell worked for Smith on her political campaigns, and prosecutors alleged that the motive for the crime was financial.
It wasn't until Becky's guilty plea and the gag order was lifted that her fiancé Tim finally saw the evidence police had been holding against her for over a year. At that moment, Tim realized he'd been completely fooled and lied to by a murderous con woman. In an exclusive interview with Dateline NBC, Tim discusses his feelings after finding out the truth about Becky.
I was shocked. I was hurt. I was mad. Here's someone that's told me this whole time how innocent she is and how she's being framed and set up and oh, now, by the way, I did it. Yeah, I was upset.
So you were sleeping and spending your life with a stab and slash killer?
Yes. Had no clue. That's why the range of emotions when I found out she did it. I mean, am I that big a fool?
Perhaps not surprisingly, Becky's admission of guilt, as well as all the evidence against her, hasn't stopped the online fringe from continuing to claim that Linda's murder was the result of a conspiracy and a massive organized cover-up. The loss of Linda Collins Smith continues to be deeply felt, not just in the physical sense, but in the void left by her passion, kindness, and tireless dedication to her community. In an address to the media following Becky's guilty plea, Linda's daughter Tate described the void left by the loss of her mother.
Today, Rebecca O'Donnell pleaded guilty to killing my mother, to abuse of my mother's body, and no contest of solicitation to commit capital murder. Today, our family has found swift justice by way of a plea deal. We know that there will be some who are not satisfied with that outcome today, and we realize that no matter what punishment Rebecca O'Donnell receives, it will never be enough. It will never bring my grandpa's daughter back, or our mother back, or our children's grandmother back. No amount of punishment will ever fill that void that Rebecca O'Donnell made in our lives the day she killed our mother. Today, we find some shred of peace that Rebecca O'Donnell will be put away in prison for a very long time, unable to hurt anyone else. If my mother was here today, I have no doubt that she would quote the Bible and tell us that we can find peace in God. We want to again thank the Arkansas State Police and the Randolph County Sheriff's Department for their hard work. Without your efforts, this case would have not been solved so quickly, but also for keeping our family's safety and privacy a priority as well. Thank you.